Miles Davis woke up every morning and said, "My future starts today." His daily creativity ritual changed jazz forever. For over 30 years, Miles began each day by declaring yesterday's music dead and challenging himself to discover something completely new. This wasn't just positive thinking, it was a systematic methodology for creative innovation that produced Birth of the Cool, Kind of Blue, and Bitches Brew. His morning routine included listening to music he'd never heard, playing scales in ways he'd never attempted, and asking himself one crucial question: what wants to be born through me today? This daily practice of creative rebirth made him jazz's most innovative artist and proved that creativity isn't inspiration, it's discipline. It was 5:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March 1959, and Miles Davis was beginning his day the same way he had for the past 15 years. He sat at the edge of his bed in his Upper West Side apartment, feet on the cold hardwood floor, and spoke the words that had become his personal mantra: "My future starts today." This wasn't a motivational slogan or empty self-help rhetoric. For Miles, it was a fundamental philosophy that had revolutionized not just his own creative process, but the entire trajectory of modern jazz. The idea had first come to him in 1944, when he was struggling as a young musician in Charlie Parker's shadow, frustrated by his own limitations and desperate to find his unique voice. Miles had realized that most musicians, even great ones, eventually became prisoners of their own success. They discovered a sound, developed a style, and then spent the rest of their careers perfecting variations on the same theme. Miles decided that this approach was creative death. Instead, he would treat each day as an opportunity to become a completely different musician. The morning routine that emerged from this philosophy was as rigorous as it was radical. After speaking his daily affirmation, Miles would make coffee, strong black, no sugar, and sit in his living room for what he called the listening hour. But this wasn't casual music appreciation. Miles had developed a systematic approach to exposing himself to sounds he had never heard before. He kept a rotating collection of records from around the world: Indian classical music, West African drum ensembles, European classical composers he'd never studied, folk music from countries he couldn't pronounce. The rule was simple: if he recognized the music, he couldn't use it for his morning listening. The goal was to flood his consciousness with musical ideas that had no connection to jazz, no relationship to his previous work, no ties to his established identity as a musician. "I'm not listening to learn songs," Miles would explain to friends who questioned his eclectic morning playlist. "I'm listening to learn possibilities. Every sound I've never heard before is a door to music that doesn't exist yet." After the listening hour came what Miles called impossible practice. This was perhaps the most challenging aspect of his daily creativity ritual. Instead of practicing music he could already play well, Miles deliberately sought out technical and musical challenges that were beyond his current abilities. He would take scales he knew perfectly and force himself to play them in rhythmic patterns he'd never attempted. He would try to recreate melodies from his morning listening session: Indian ragas, African polyrhythms, classical fugues, using his trumpet in ways that pushed him far outside his comfort zone. Most importantly, he would improvise over chord progressions he'd never seen before, forcing himself to discover new relationships between notes and harmonies. "If I can play it comfortably, it's not worth playing," became another of Miles's creative principles. Comfort is the enemy of innovation. The moment you stop struggling, you stop growing. This philosophy of creative discomfort extended beyond technical practice into composition and conceptual thinking. Every morning, after his impossible practice session, Miles would spend 30 minutes with what he called his creation notebook, a leather-bound journal where he documented musical ideas, philosophical observations, and most importantly, questions about possibilities he hadn't yet explored. The notebook wasn't filled with completed songs or finished musical thoughts. Instead, it contained fragments, questions, and challenges. What would happen if I played ballads like they were fast bebop? How would Round Midnight sound if I approached it like African ceremonial music? What if the rhythm section played against the melody instead of supporting it? These weren't idle musical musings. They were systematic explorations of creative territory that would eventually become the foundation for albums like Birth of the Cool, Sketches of Spain, and the electric period that revolutionized jazz in the late 1960s. Miles's band members gradually became aware of his morning creativity ritual, and they began to see its effects in rehearsals and recording sessions. Pianist Bill Evans, who worked with Miles during the Kind of Blue period, noticed that Miles would arrive at sessions with ideas that seemed to come from nowhere. Miles would walk into the studio with a musical concept that was completely different from anything we'd been working on, Evans remembered. It wasn't that he had written new songs. It was like he had discovered a new way of thinking about music itself. Later I realized that this came from his daily practice of creative exploration. The discipline required for Miles's morning routine was extraordinary. It meant waking up early every day, including after late-night performances. It meant deliberately frustrating himself with musical challenges that had no immediate payoff. Most difficult of all, it meant abandoning musical ideas that were working well in favor of pursuing possibilities that might not work at all. During the recording of Birth of the Cool in 1949 and 1950, Miles's daily creativity practice was producing ideas faster than he could implement them. The album's revolutionary approach to jazz arranging, using instruments like French horn and tuba, creating textures that were both sophisticated and accessible, came directly from Miles's morning explorations of classical music and his questions about how those sonic possibilities could be adapted to jazz. Miles would come to rehearsal with these arrangements that didn't sound like anything we'd heard before, remembered baritone saxophonist Jerry Mulligan. When we asked him where the ideas came from, he'd just say, "I heard something this morning that made me think about what we weren't doing." The creative methodology that Miles had developed was becoming a template for systematic innovation. Instead of waiting for inspiration to strike randomly, he had created a daily practice that consistently generated new musical possibilities. This approach reached its full expression during the recording of Kind of Blue in 1959. Miles's morning creativity ritual had led him to explore modal jazz, a harmonic approach that used scales rather than chord progressions as the foundation for improvisation. This wasn't a sudden discovery, but the result of months of morning practice sessions where Miles had experimented with playing over single chords for extended periods, asking himself how melody could be created without traditional harmonic movement. The famous story of Kind of Blue being largely improvised in the studio misses the deeper truth. While the specific performances were spontaneous, the musical concepts had been developed through years of daily creative exploration. Miles brought sketch-like compositions to the session, but the real preparation had happened every morning as he systematically pushed himself beyond his previous musical understanding. John Coltrane, who played on Kind of Blue, was particularly influenced by Miles's daily creativity practice. "Miles showed me that innovation isn't about having great ideas occasionally," Coltrane said. "It's about having a daily practice that makes great ideas inevitable." By the mid-1960s, Miles's morning creativity ritual was evolving along with the changing musical landscape. He began incorporating electronic music, rock rhythms, and funk grooves into his listening sessions. His impossible practice sessions now included playing along with James Brown records and experimenting with electronic effects that were transforming popular music. This daily exposure to non-jazz influences, combined with his systematic approach to creative challenge, produced the electric period that culminated in albums like In a Silent Way and Bitches Brew. These recordings shocked the jazz world because they represented a complete departure from Miles's previous work, but they were actually the logical result of his daily commitment to creative evolution. People thought Miles had suddenly decided to play electric music, recalled keyboardist Joe Zawinul, who worked on In a Silent Way, but if you understood his daily practice, you could see that he'd been preparing for this change for years. Every morning, he was asking himself what music wanted to be born that had never existed before. The systematic nature of Miles's creativity ritual also influenced his approach to leading bands. Instead of hiring musicians who could perfectly execute his existing music, Miles deliberately chose players who brought different musical perspectives and technical approaches. He wanted band members who would force him to adapt and discover new possibilities during performances. Miles told me when he hired me that he didn't want me to play like his previous bass players, remembered Michael Henderson, who joined Miles's band in the early 1970s. He said, "I want you to play bass like you've never heard jazz before. Make me have to figure out how to play trumpet over what you're doing." This approach to band leadership was an extension of Miles's personal creativity philosophy. Just as he challenged himself every morning with unfamiliar music and impossible practice, He surrounded himself with musicians who would challenge his established musical thinking. The documentation in Miles's creation notebook from this period reveals the depth of his systematic approach to innovation. Entries from 1969 include questions like, what if the drums led the melody instead of keeping time? And how would this music sound if everyone played their instruments like they were percussion? These questions weren't theoretical. They became the foundation for the exploratory sessions that produced Bitches Brew, an album that essentially created the fusion genre by applying Miles's daily creativity methodology to a full band context. As Miles aged, his morning creativity ritual evolved, but never disappeared. In the 1970s and 1980s, he incorporated hip-hop, world music, and contemporary pop influences into his daily listening sessions. His impossible practice sessions now included experimenting with synthesizers and electronic effects that were transforming all forms of music. Even when Miles was in his 60s, he was still waking up every morning and saying, "My future starts today," remembered percussionist Mott Toom, who worked with Miles in the mid-1970s. He never stopped challenging himself to discover something new. The creative philosophy that had begun as a personal practice gradually influenced an entire generation of musicians. Jazz artists began to understand that innovation required systematic daily work rather than occasional bursts of inspiration. Music schools started teaching courses on creative methodology based on Miles's approach to daily artistic exploration. More broadly, Miles's creativity ritual demonstrated principles that applied far beyond music. His systematic approach to daily learning, his commitment to deliberate discomfort, and his practice of treating each day as an opportunity for rebirth became models for creative professionals in every field. The legacy of Miles's daily creativity practice extends beyond the specific albums and innovations it produced. It proved that creativity is not a mysterious force that strikes randomly, but a discipline that can be developed through consistent daily practice. It showed that innovation requires the courage to abandon previous successes in favor of unknown possibilities. Most importantly, Miles's morning ritual demonstrated that the future is not something that happens to us, but something we create through our daily choices and commitments. By saying, "My future starts today" every morning for over 30 years, Miles Davis didn't just change jazz, he proved that systematic creativity can continuously transform both art and artist. When Miles died in 1991, his creation notebook contained over 3,000 entries spanning 5 decades of daily creative exploration. The final entry, written just weeks before his death, contained a single question: what music exists that I haven't heard yet? That question, and the daily practice it represented, encapsulated Miles Davis's approach to creativity and life. He understood that innovation is not a destination but a daily journey, and that the future belongs to those who are willing to abandon their past in pursuit of possibilities they cannot yet imagine. If this story of daily creativity, systematic innovation, and the discipline of artistic rebirth moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand that creativity is not inspiration, it's practice. Have you developed daily routines that challenge you to grow beyond your current abilities? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to check out more stories about the systematic approaches that create lasting innovation.